Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another instalment in the Sydney Railroad build. This week's presentation is a little different from my normal offerings, mainly because this bridge project was not done as a single block of time. It was worked on concurrently with other projects, a little here and a little there, over several weeks. So rather than making a series of regular video clips, instead I just made sure I took photographs at every step of the way, and then added a voiceover to the slideshow to explain what I'm doing at every step. So anyway, without further ado, let's just turn the camera around and get on with the show. This is how the bridge site looked when I last showed you the area. There is a temporary piece of plywood, the exact size of 3 of the truss spans, with some plywood legs the right height. One of the truss spans is sitting in the middle for comparison. And this is how the bridge sat for a couple of months while I worked on other parts of the railroad. In this view, the 3 bridge spans have been painted. Although they may look black, it's actually a very dark grey, which I find looks better than pure black. And I've also cut bridge piers and abutments to fit. Here is another view from the other end of the bridge, taken at the same time. However, there is a problem with the bridge piers. In this closer view we can see the nature of the problem. Even with the smallest bridge shoes supplied in the kit, they are right on the corners of the piers, and it really just does not look believable. I discussed it with the client and we both agreed that we needed bigger piers, although I was unable to find any commercially. So I decided to carve my own master and cast my own. Here is the first step in the pier making process. I have a wooden core attached to a base. It's a rectangle of 3/4 inch plywood with some angled pieces on the ends. Note that I'm only building half the pier. The plan is to join 2 of them together, and the same casting will also be used by itself for the abutments. Here is the method of flattening the DAS clay into a uniform thickness. I have 2 thin sticks of plywood the same thickness, and I'm using a piece of 2-inch PVC pipe as a rolling pin. And I just roll the clay out into a sheet of a uniform thickness. The clear plastic behind it stops it from sticking to the board. With the clay sheet rolled to a uniform thickness, it's now time to attach it to the wooden core. I didn't glue it. I thought it would stick well enough. I was wrong, and we'll see why in later views. Here's the clay covering completed, although with no surface detail carved yet. I started carving the surface detail from the bottom, worked my way up, using both an X-Acto knife and a dental pick. I ended up using the X-Acto knife almost exclusively, although it's worth experimenting with different tools and just using whatever works best for you. Here is a later view with the stonework continued further up the wall. And here is the stonework fully carved. I still don't have the concrete capping yet. Here it is with the concrete cap. I made that out of 2 thicknesses of 60 thou styrene, and I've also filled in a few gaps using Tamiya modeler's putty. Those are the dark grey stains you can see in a few places. The next thing to do is to build the mould box around it. Here I have attached 4 strips of plywood to the base to make that mould box. Here I've just started mixing up the silicone rubber to fill the mould. Now normally I use Micromark silicone rubber, and I usually buy it when they have specials with free shipping or something like that. However, they had no specials available this time, so I found this alternative product on Amazon, and although the base price was only slightly less, I got free shipping on it, which meant that the overall cost was little more than half what it would have been at Micromark. This rubber works just as well as the Micromark offering. The only thing I didn't like about it is that both parts are clear, so there's no indication of when it's properly mixed. At least with the Micromark, you have 1 blue part and 1 white part, and you mix it until you have a uniform light blue. So to get around that lack of a visual indicator, I just kept mixing for a lot longer than I thought I needed to. In this view you can see I have filled the mould box. For a large mould like this, I make sure I have about 3/8 of an inch of rubber over the top of the master. For smaller moulds, 1/4 inch is probably enough. And I fill it until it just starts to overflow the edge, and then I put wedges under one side or another if necessary to make sure it's completely level. In this view, the mould has cured. It's supposed to need 4 hours. I left it overnight just to be safe. I've started to dismantle the box by backing out the screws that hold the sides on, and after that it's just a case of pulling the sides off and then gently peeling the silicone rubber back from the base. Here I've removed the sides, but I haven't yet started the peel operation. I've now peeled the mould off the master, and now you can see the result of not gluing the clay to the core. It stuck to the rubber even though I used a release agent. Now this is not a big problem. The thing to remember here is that we're not trying to save the master. That has done its job. What I really have to be certain of is that I don't now damage the mould. As you can see, I struggled to get some of the clay out. It just wanted to break up. Originally I was hoping that I would be able to save it in one piece so that I can cut sections of wall for different shaped moulds, but alas, that was not possible. There's quite a lot of it that's stuck in the mould, and I had to laboriously pick it out, being very careful not to damage the mould in any way. With that done, the next step is to start making castings. Here we have one in progress, along with a pair of wing walls in another mould just behind it. I used the excess from the batch after first filling the main mould and then using whatever's left over for the smaller mould. Here I have 6 castings and another one on the way. Overall, in theory, I only need 6, but I wanted to make a couple of spares just in case I damaged some. I thought that the corners of the concrete caps might be quite fragile, and it turned out I was right. I did break a couple. Here is a test fit with 2 castings back to back. As you can see, there is a significant gap between them, so I still have to flatten off the back on a piece of sandpaper and then fill any remaining gap between them. Here is a test fit with 2 of those castings back to back under the bridge and cut to size. And I think this looks a whole lot better than the previous one. The proportions are now about right. Here is another view from the opposite direction. And here we have a wider angle showing both the old and new piers for comparison. I think this adequately demonstrates that the extra effort of making the new mould was well worth the effort. In this view, I've glued 2 pairs of castings back to back with wood glue, and I'm using the tape to hold them together as a clamp. Since the castings were still a little bit green at this point, and it's a deep glue joint, I left it overnight just to make sure that it was properly set up. The next step is to fill any imperfections with spackle. In this view you can see that I've done that. And then once that has dried off, it's just a case of recarving the detail at the end. And in this case I found that the dental pick was a better tool than the knife. Quite the opposite to when I did the original carving. You can see that I've completed the one on the left. The one on the right is still in its raw state. There is still a small gap in the concrete cap where the spackle fell out, so I eventually filled that with Tamiya putty. In this view the piers are positioned approximately in the right places, and you can see the grey stain at the end of the near pier where I filled the hole with putty. Here is the first overview of the bridge with all the new piers and abutments in place. The head wall in the foreground is not part of the new pier. It's cut from one of the original castings. I'm not sure what I'm trying to show in this photograph. I'm guessing it was after I glued the piers in place permanently using the same wood glue that I use for everything else. And here is another overall view from the other end after the piers are glued in place. If you look at the abutment in the foreground, you see there is still quite a big gap between the end of the truss and the start of the plywood sub-road bed. In this view I've used spackle to fill the trough behind the abutment. Once that's dry, it will form a ledge for the head wall. Here I have the head wall and wing walls glued in place. Note that I haven't yet spackled the imperfections in the various joints, and also the stonework on the wing walls are slightly different to what I carved on the abutment, and although it's not that noticeable, it can be hidden even better with judicious position of foliage. Here is a view of the abutment at the other end. Originally I was going to use a different design of wing wall at this point because the river curves around the edge, so I was thinking of slanting it back, but then I found out it was going to require a lot more cutting and patching of small chunks of plaster casting than I really wanted to get into. So I just made it the same. And here is an overall view with all the stonework in place. In this view I have removed the bridge trusses and I have painted in the approximate location of the river. Note the bare patch under the left hand pier. The intention is to provide some asymmetry in the scene by putting that pier on a sandbank and the other one in the water. The water also runs along the edge of the benchwork for about another 10 feet off to the right of the picture, making the whole scene a lot more asymmetrical than it might otherwise have been. Here I have the first base coat on the entire area, including the piers and abutments. The idea being that I will now gradually lighten it with various shades of grey and brown until I end up with a pleasing appearance. Here are the three colours that I use for painting the piers. Basically just black, white and burnt umber. And I can mix all the shades I need from just those three. In this view I have started the dry brushing process, and I've also gathered the additional paint colours that I need for the concrete capping. Here it is with all the base coats done, although there is no weathering on any part of it at this point. Here is a side view of the whole bridge in the same state. The next thing I need to do is work on the track that crosses it. Here are the 4 lengths of micro-engineering bridge track with the ends modified and the guardrails attached. The 3 spans together were slightly less than 2-yard lengths of track, allowing just enough room for about 2 inches to protrude from each end. So I trim the tie base off at the right length and then carefully slide 5 or 6 picot ties onto the end of the rails. I use picot for this instead of the micro-engineering because the tie clips are more robust. I like the micro-engineering bridge track much better than the Walthers offering. Not only is it available in longer lengths, but the inner guardrails are a smaller section. So if you order Code 83 bridge track, you get Code 70 guardrails, which is about right for the prototype. And it also means that you can clean your track without polishing the inner guardrails. Here is the track with the first base colour sprayed on. Any flat dark brown will work. Here I've used a scrap of plywood to wipe most of the paint off the running rails. I did the ones on the right of the frame first. Unfortunately, by the time I did the ones on the left, I'd already worn a groove in the edge of the plywood, so it took some of the paint off the guardrails as well. But not to worry, that will get covered up in the next step anyway. The next step is to use a rust colour on the sides of the rails, and I found that mixing brown oxide with orange gives a nice colour. And although it's kind of tedious doing it with a brush, you really don't have to be neat. And then once I finish that, the last step is to just hit the whole thing with a very thin dark brown wash to blend the colours. With the track prepared, I'm now gluing all 3 spans to the piers. The end 2 have already been done, and the middle one is just waiting for the glue. I use the same crafter's pick glue as I use for laying track. Here it is with all 3 spans glued down to the piers and weighted, and I just leave it several hours for the glue to go nice and hard before I disturb it. In this view I am starting to install the track. I put thin beads of glue under each of the running rails where they will sit directly on the floor beams. There's also a much heavier glue application on the ties that go off the end onto the foam rubber roadbed. Then I slide it in from the end upside down and carefully turn it over before positioning it accurately. Here the first track has been installed and weighted. Note that before I got the glue out, I did make the approach pieces just so that I can sight along it from both ends and make sure that I don't have any kinks in the alignment. You can see here the approach piece in position with the rail joiners on, although that has not yet been glued down because I still have to take it off to put the feeders on. And then once the feeders are in place, I will solder the rail joints at each end of the bridge, leaving the centre as an expansion gap. Here is the second track going in. You may note that I already have the feeders under the approach track on this side of the bridge. That was a mistake. It turned out to be a lot more difficult to do it that way, which is why I didn't do the other 3. Here it is with all the track installed. In this view, I've already removed the approach pieces, soldered on the feeders and glued them in place. So at this point, once all the glue is dry, the bridge is ready for service. Here is an overall view with everything installed. And here is a view from the other end. Note how the slight angle relative to the edge of the benchwork adds a lot of interest to the scene, a lot more than if it had run straight. The only thing missing at this point is some additional weathering. Although I have lightly weathered the trusses, I have not done anything on the piers or abutments yet. In this view I have added weathering to the abutments. I wanted rust stains around the bridge shoes, for which I used weathering powders. Although I was careful to make sure that the rust stains were very subtle, they look a lot starker in the photo than they do in real life, and I don't know why that is. In person they look a lot more subtle than they do here. And also, since this pier is going to be sitting in water, I wanted a green stain around the base to represent moss and algae at the water level. That last effect is on only the right-hand pier. If you recall from earlier, the left-hand pier will sit on a sandbank, so it will not have those green stains. So here is a broader view taken after the additional weathering was in place. And being further away, once again they do look a lot more subtle here. And here is a view from the other end. And here is a view from the side. Well, I think that is about all there is to say about this project, and brings up the end of this video. Please let me know in the comments below whether you like the new style of presentation, and maybe I'll use it again for future projects where it makes sense to do so. I'm going to sign off here, and I hope to see you back again next week. So in the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.